My name is Sophie. I'm 32 and I will never forget the sound of my husband's laugh as he signed our divorce papers. It wasn't joy, it wasn't nervousness, it was triumph. The smug curl of his lips was a wound carved deep into my memory. He thought he had won. He thought he was walking away from me with everything: my dignity, my future, my worth. But what he didn't know was that I had already built a life he couldn't touch. That morning, the courtroom felt like a tomb. The polished wood of the table under my palms was icy, my hands damp with sweat no matter how still I held them. Across from me, Nathan leaned toward his lawyer, whispering smugly, letting out that cruel laugh, as though it were punctuation on the end of our 10-year marriage. He caught my eye once, and the look he gave me made my stomach turn a cocktail of pity and superiority that said, "Poor Sophie, what will you ever do without me?" I turned my gaze away, focusing on the American flag beside the judge's bench, on the slow tick of the clock, on the words of my own lawyer, Mr. Davies, echoing in my head, "Do not let him see you sweat, Sophie. Your composure is your weapon." So I kept my face calm, even as Nathan's attorney droned on about the settlement they thought I should accept. The terms were humiliating scraps, barely enough for a small apartment, like a king tossing a coin to a beggar. The humiliation was a cloak pressing down on my shoulders, but I didn't flinch. Finally, it was our turn. Mr. Davies rose slowly, deliberate as an oak bending in the wind. His voice was clear as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we find the proposed terms acceptable. However, this morning we filed an amended financial disclosure for my client." He set down a thick, spiral-bound document with a solid thud. Nathan's smirk faltered just slightly. His lawyer flipped open the first page with practiced ease, but I saw the stiffening in his posture. He wasn't expecting this. Nathan frowned, confused. In his mind, my entire financial identity was tethered to his. What could I possibly have to disclose? As the courtroom shifted, my mind slipped backward away from the cold, into the memory of our beginning. Horizon Tech. Our so-called empire hadn't started in a gleaming office. It started in a garage that smelled of oil and damp concrete. Nathan was the coder, the genius with his head full of algorithms. But I was the one who saw the bigger picture, who mapped out the user experience, the subscription model, the entire marketing strategy. I remember drawing it all on the whiteboard, with a marker clutched in my hand, my pulse racing with inspiration. I remember the look in his eyes when I finished, like I was fire, like I was the future. He whispered, "Sophie, you're a genius." But a year later, when we stood in a boardroom in front of investors, it was Nathan who presented that strategy, as though it had been born in his mind. He smiled that charming smile and said, "Sometimes the best ideas just demand to be born." I clapped for him, swallowing the hurt, telling myself his success was my success. That was the start of my vanishing. I became the ghost in the machine, the one who ran HR, who decorated the office, who hosted the dinners, who stayed smiling while he cut me off whenever I tried to speak. If someone asked about me, Nathan would pat my arm and say, "She has her little hobbies." My sketches, my designs, my passion reduced to hobbies. Every word he used to belittle me was another log on a fire burning quietly inside me. The final crack came on a rainy anniversary. I went to surprise him at the office with pastries, only to see him laughing with a young pregnant woman, his hand resting on her back. And when she asked who I was, he didn't call me his wife. He said I was an old acquaintance abandoned by her husband, someone he was generously helping find a job. In that moment, I wasn't even his wife in his story. I was a pity case. That night, I didn't scream or fight. I called Clara, my best friend, the only one who knew what I'd given up. She told me, "Are you going to keep being a ghost in your own house, or are you going to start haunting him?" That was the spark. I rented a tiny studio with my savings and built SVN Studio in secret. I lived a double life, dutiful wife by day, designer by night. I worked until dawn, made mistakes, fell on my face, but I kept going. Slowly, sales trickled in. A blogger wore one of my dresses and orders poured through my crashed website. I was exhausted, terrified, alive, and Nathan noticed nothing. Months passed. And then just before our divorce, hearing a letter arrived an acquisition offer from a Paris fashion house. $25 million circled in red ink, proof that my hobby had become an empire. So now here I sat in court, Nathan laughing, thinking he had won. And across from me, his lawyer's smile was finally beginning to fade as he turned page after page of my disclosure. The silence in the room sharpened. Nathan's smirk was gone. And I sat still, my composure was my weapon. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his chair creaking as his lawyer flipped another page. The silence was no longer mine to hold, it pressed down on him now. His face, once smug and entertained, had gone rigid. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, the disbelief crawling across his skin as the numbers stared back at him. 25 million. That was the valuation of SVN Studio, the fashion house I had built in secret. And it wasn't just paper wealth. My lawyer had attached bank statements showing recent deposits, contracts signed with European buyers, trademarks, patents. Every page was a nail hammered into the coffin of the man who thought he had stripped me bare. But to understand what those numbers meant, you'd have to understand what it took to get them. The months I spent pretending to be Nathan's dutiful wife while sneaking out to late-night supplier meetings. The lies I told about yoga classes when I was really sketching designs in cafes with trembling hands. The mornings I washed dishes with bloodied fingertips because I had spent the night sewing until the needle pricked me raw. There were nights I wanted to give up. Nights when the shadows in my little studio whispered that I was insane to think I could do this alone. That I was just a woman who used to be somebody's wife trying to stitch together scraps of dignity. But then I'd remember the way Nathan laughed when he called my dreams hobbies. That laugh became the fire under my skin, pushing me forward. I still remember my first real Order 10 dresses from a boutique in New York. I barely had the money to buy fabric, so I maxed out the last of my credit cards. I worked until dawn sewing with a mix of hope and fear and shipped them off praying they wouldn't be returned. Weeks later, a photo of a woman wearing one of my dresses went viral. Orders flooded my inbox faster than I could track them. I cried on the floor of my studio, clutching my laptop, not from despair but from relief. And Nathan. He didn't notice a thing. He thought my tired eyes came from loneliness, from waiting up for him. He thought the glow on my cheeks was the reflection of his success, not the light of my own. In the courtroom, the judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Nathan. "Mr. Collins, are you aware of your wife's independent assets?" He stammered, his voice breaking in a way I had never heard before. "I know, Your Honor. She didn't have any when we—" "Correction," Mr. Davies interrupted smoothly. "She had ideas. She had talent. What she lacked was freedom. And when she found it, she turned it into an empire." Nathan's eyes snapped to me, then wide and full of something I had never seen in him before. Not superiority, not pity. Fear. He had underestimated me so completely that the shock left him speechless. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. I simply held his gaze and let him feel the silence he had once weaponized against me. The judge cleared her throat. "In light of this disclosure, the settlement terms will need to be adjusted. Given Mrs. Collins' considerable independent assets, the court will proceed accordingly." Nathan's lawyer tried to recover, whispering furiously to him, but it was too late. The image of control Nathan had clung to was shattered. And in that moment, I thought back to the girl I used to be, the one who cheered for him in the boardroom, who clapped for ideas stolen from her lips, who believed his success was hers too. I wanted to reach back in time to hold her hand, to tell her, "You will rise. He will not define you forever." The courtroom recessed for lunch, and as I stood, Nathan finally broke his silence. "Sophie," he hissed, his voice low and desperate. How long have you been hiding this?" "Long." I looked at him, this man who once swore he'd love me forever, who reduced me to a shadow in my own life. And I whispered, "Long enough to know I don't need you." His face crumpled. The laugh that had once haunted me was gone. In its place was silence, my power. When court recessed, the hallway felt colder than the courtroom, like the air had been held too long and exhaled all at once. The crowd spilled out in neat streams. Lawyers with briefcases, couples with clasped hands, security guards with practiced boredom. I stood by the window watching dust motes float through a blade of winter sun, aware of every inch of my skin. The way you are after a wound closes new tender reel. Nathan found me there. He didn't approach at first. He prowled. I could feel the heat of his stare before I felt his steps. His shoes were a metronome of fury on the tile. "You made me look like a fool," he said from behind me, voice low and tight. He moved closer, jaw-clenched eyes rimmed with red. The smugness was gone, replaced by a stunned animal anger, something raw and wounded. I turned slowly and leaned back against the windowsill, keeping my hands still. "You did that." "That company," he hissed, catching himself searching for a word that might make him the rightful owner of something he never touched. "That thing, you hid it, you lied." The accusation slid off me. In another life, I would have scrambled to explain, to soothe the beast, to bandage a pride that had always drained me dry. In this one, I felt oddly gentle, like I'd found an old photograph from a life I no longer lived. "I protected what you would have taken." He flinched. It was small, almost nothing, but I saw it. Because he knew. He knew who he was when power was within reach. He knew the contracts he'd changed at the last minute. The stories he'd told that made him the sun and me his reflection. He knew the night he forgot our anniversary and texted the woman with the moon tattoo. "Wish you were here," while I sat in our kitchen slicing strawberries for a cake he wouldn't taste. My mind wandered back to the memory that had been the beginning of my ending. It wasn't the woman in the office, not the hand on her back. It was the night after, when I asked him quietly, no accusations, just questions, where we had gone wrong, if he still saw me. He laughed. Not the sharp laugh of triumph. A soft, pitying one, the sound people reserve for someone who doesn't understand the rules. "Sophie," he said, "you're overthinking. We're fine. Besides, we both know who carries the real weight here." He gestured to himself. I watched the gesture more than I heard the words. An elegant motion, sure of the world, bending toward him. I had gone to bed that night and stared at the ceiling until dawn, the ceiling fan turning shadows into a slow, hypnotic wheel. It wasn't rage that kept me awake. It was the quiet certainty that if I didn't choose myself, no one would. Not him, not the investors, not the friends who liked me best when I took photos at their parties and held their purses while they danced. A bailiff cleared his throat somewhere down the hall. Nathan's lawyer hovered, then thought better of it and retreated, phone pressed to his ear. I could hear Mr. Davies' voice farther off, measured, steady, negotiating lunch with the faintest suggestion of soup. The mundanity of it all, soup schedules, felt bizarrely holy. Life went on even when hearts cracked open under it. "You planned this," Nathan said finally, almost in wonder, almost in awe. He ran a hand through his hair. "All of it. The secrecy, the timing." "I planned my survival," I answered. "The rest is just light finding its way through a hole you didn't know you made." He laughed, then short, humorless. "You think this makes you better than me?" "No," I said. "It makes me whole. That's all I ever wanted." He looked at me like I had spoken a language he didn't believe existed. Whole to him meant full of praise, full of rooms with his name on the plaques, full of photos where women tilted their heads toward him like flowers. My whole was quieter, the steady hum of a sewing machine at 2 a.m. The first email from Paris, typed in polite English, that made my hands shake, the shop owner in Queens who hugged me after my first reorder and smelled like cinnamon and courage. He stepped closer, too close, and for a heartbeat the old fear tried to wake in me. I felt it stretch and yawn and then choose sleep again. "If you had told me," he said, "we could have—" "Put your name on it," I asked. "Turned my yes into your yes again." He shut his eyes. When he opened them, he wasn't the monarch I'd married or the boy I'd once believed in. He was just a man whose map no longer matched the streets. "Congratulations," he said, voice low. "You outplayed me." "This was never a game," I said. "This was my life." He left then, or maybe I did. The memory wavers like heat above asphalt. I know I ended up in the restroom, palms on the sink, breath a thin line. I met my own eyes in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Chin lifted, mouth set, a fine tremor in her hands that looked like a tuning fork finding pitch. Not hard. In tune. At lunch I couldn't swallow more than 3 bites. Mr. Davies didn't push. He told me a story about a cat that had moved into his backyard uninvited and now ruled his home with tyrannical affection. I laughed, an actual laugh, surprised out of me like a bird startled into flight. The sound felt like a key turning in a lock. Back in the courtroom, the judge returned with her hair a little frizzed from the humidity glasses smudged at one corner. She looked at us with the steady gaze of someone who has seen people end and begin 1,000 times. "We will proceed," she said. "In the matter of Collins versus Collins, having reviewed the amended disclosures, my heartbeat didn't speed up, it aligned. The judge spoke of fairness and division of clean lines and clean hands. She didn't say the word vindication. She didn't need to. I felt it hum in the wood, in the air conditioner's steady drone, in the muscle of my own jaw unclenching. Nathan's lawyer argued minor points, small pebbles thrown at a tide. The tide ignored them. When the gavel finally fell, it was not an ending so much as the sound of a lid sealing, preserving what needed to be kept, letting the rest spoil without me. Nathan stared straight ahead. I didn't look at him. There are moments you teach yourself to stop checking for the face of the person who hurt you. This was one of them. Outside, the sky had shifted to a stern, forgiving blue. Mr. Davies shook my hand and said, "Go do something ordinary. Celebrate with a sandwich." I promised I would and meant it. On the steps, my phone buzzed with a new email. Paris again, a revised term sheet kinder than the first respectful. They called SVN Studio a house with a voice. I touched the screen like it was a living thing. I thought of the years I'd been told my voice was a hobby. I thought of the seam ripper on my sewing table, a tiny blade that undoes mistakes one stitch at a time. That had been me. Undoing, restitching, learning the difference between mending and erasing. I walked to the corner deli and ordered the best sandwich I could name. I ate it on a curb in my soup, mustard on my sleeve, sun on my face, the courthouse behind me like a building in a story someone else had told. At the bottom of the bag, I found an extra cookie the clerk had slipped, in a small, undeserved grace. I broke it in half and saved the other piece for later, a promise to a future I was finally hungry for. The night after the divorce was finalized, I didn't cry the way movies tell you women do. No wine, no shredded tissues, no sad music curling through the room. I sat on the floor of my studio with the hum of the sewing machine still ringing in my ears, and I let silence hold me like an old friend. It wasn't peace yet, not fully. It was something sharper, like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ocean sprawling wide below, knowing you had survived the fall before and could do it again if you had to. I kept replaying Nathan's laugh in my head, not the one he gave when he signed those papers, but the first one years ago in our garage. Back then, it had been full of awe, like he couldn't believe I had seen something he hadn't. How quickly awe turns to arrogance. How quickly admiration curdles into contempt when power shifts. And yet I wasn't bitter in that moment. I was grieving, yes, but not for him. I grieved for the girl I had been when I first sketched a dress on the back of a grocery receipt, cheeks flushed with hope rushing to show the man I loved. I grieved for how small I had made myself so he could stand taller. For the applause I never got because I handed it to him instead. But grief has teeth, it bites, and in biting it teaches. The next morning I woke before dawn, pulled on a sweater, and walked the city streets, while most windows were still dark. I thought of how many nights I had walked those same streets to meet suppliers, carrying bolts of fabric heavier than my own body, praying no one would notice how tired I was. Those walks had felt endless. This one felt like arriving. When I got home, I opened the Paris contract again. My hand trembled as I signed it, not from fear, but from the weight of claiming something fully mine for the first time. 25 million. The number was staggering, yes, but it wasn't the money that made my breath catch. It was the validation, the proof that every sleepless night, every dropped stitch, every tear on the floor of my studio had meant something. Later that week, Nathan called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice was smaller, quieter, like a balloon losing air. "Sophie," he said, "maybe we should talk. We don't have to be enemies. We can work together." Horizon Tech and SVN Studio, think about the possibilities. I almost laughed, but not cruelly, more like disbelief at how blind he still was. "Nathan," I said, "I don't need you, not as a partner, not as an enemy. I'm done letting you orbit my life like I'm just another planet you claim gravity over." There was silence. And then he whispered, "I never thought you'd outgrow me." The truth was, I hadn't outgrown him. I had outgrown the version of myself that believed I needed his permission to shine. That was the real loss he couldn't articulate, not the money, not the company, but me. I hung up and didn't feel guilty, I felt free. Weeks later at the Paris signing, I wore one of my own designs, a deep blue dress with clean lines and quiet power stitched into every seam. Flashbulbs popped, champagne flowed, and yet all I could think of was the little studio where it had all begun and the woman who had whispered to herself in the dark, "Keep going." That woman had carried me here, and I would never abandon her again. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been where I was, made small by someone else's shadow, convinced your worth was theirs to define. Maybe you're stitching together scraps of courage in a world that tells you your dreams are hobbies. If that's you, hear me. You are not invisible. You are not disposable. You are not someone's footnote. You are your own story. Thank you for walking through mine. If it resonated, if it lit even a spark of recognition in you, please, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories that speak the truths we're told to bury. And leave a comment. Tell me your story. Because every voice deserves to be heard, especially yours. Sometimes revenge is not destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear. And sometimes that refusal is enough to change everything.